Hello, welcome back to our live coverage of the UN Climate Talks here in Cancun in Mexico. Delighted to say that we've been joined by Henn of 350.org, and Jamie's going to give us a bit of an update on the kind of global climate movement and what they're up to. We're going to cover American politics, but first we'll start with the situation here at the talks. I know you've been here for a few days now, Jamie. What do you make of the progress? Should we be optimistic?
I'm not sure we should be optimistic, might be stretching it. You know, I usually am very optimistic about these sorts of things. But it's been a tough 10 days, and I think it's been a bit of a confusing 10 days as well. I think that in Copenhagen, while a lot was happening behind the scenes, a lot was out in the open as well. There was a sense of real debate. There was a sense that issues were being tackled. Here in Cancun, I think almost all of it seems to be behind the scenes. While it appears as if there's a vacuum and really nothing is happening officially, I think there's actually quite a bit that's being worked out and pushed kind of through back channels, and none of it really is all that good. I think the U.S. continues to weaken progress here. I think that there's been little movement around some of the key issues. Some promising, but not as much as one might expect. So no, I'd say the outlook on the talks hasn't been very productive. That said, if I had to identify a few glimmers of hope, I think that those might be coming, you know, over the next few days. The environment ministers are here. Island nations are really speaking out about the need for strong targets. Some of those might be actually making it back into the text. And as usual, these talks are always a fascinating time to be hearing from civil society and all of that about the plans that they're making, looking at the next 2 years of really moving things forward.
Okay, so maybe that's a good note for me to remind our viewers that you're watching this live, so you can interact with us if you like, pitch in a couple of comments or questions. You can do that by using the hashtag #OneClimate on Twitter or on the comments box on the website that you're viewing this page on. Well, so you've said that you think there's some hope and that there might be some movement in the next couple of days. What should we be aiming for? Like, we've been told legally binding treaty isn't going to be realistically happening here. So, like, what should I be satisfied with if I come away from this conference?
Look, I think there's a couple different strategies that one could approach this conference with. One is to try and make some small little pieces of progress that we can build into a larger treaty. I think that I would say the majority of people, that's the approach that they're taking. I'm not entirely convinced by that. And I think that there's another strategy that may be more important, actually, which is to use these meetings to create more of a sense of outrage about the lack of progress, about the idea that governments really aren't stepping up to the plate, that big polluters back at home in a lot of these key countries are holding back the steps that our nations really need to be taking. And use these meetings as a reminder that the real key here and the real change will come through our ability to actually build a movement back at home that can push our governments to come to meetings like this, not to sell us out, but to really negotiate even more.
We've got people sending comments in saying they agree with you, so that's a message that is being popularly received. But actually, there isn't a sense of outrage, is there? If you go out there, like aside from on the comments section of the Huffington Post, people don't seem that animated by climate change at the moment. And although there is a kind of a big movement to try and address this issue, it's nowhere near the kind of scale and commitment that we would need to cope with it. Why isn't this kind of animating people?
Well, I think it's a good question. I do think in large part there is a growing movement out there, and I don't think it is always as visible as people would see. I think that part of that is because it's been very mild-mannered in some ways. You know, at 350.org, we've put a real focus on being positive about working on solutions, about trying to lead by example. And I think that that's been successful in really growing up a big base around the world. You know, our last day of action this year was even larger than before Copenhagen, over 7,200 events in 188 countries. That said, moving forward, I think that we need to be a bit more aggressive and really start going after the fossil fuel companies that are standing in the way of progress, really beginning to target the politicians that are standing in the way. And I think that as a movement that is both rooted in the solutions and positive vision we need, but also a bit more aggressive to really stand up to the people that are continuing to screw us over no matter what we do, we'll begin to see a bit more progress and hopefully a bit more pressure on these negotiations.
What does that mean, though? What are you talking about? So some of 350's campaigns so far, they've been incredibly visual in the sense of the artistic sense, and so they've got a lot of press coverage around the world, and I think people have really felt they've been able to buy into them. Are you suggesting that the movement needs to move into a more political sphere, or that it's maybe, are we talking direct action? What's what does more aggressive mean?
All of the above. First, I would say that I think that the visual piece of it is still really important, actually. When you look at the influence that the fossil fuel companies have on our process, it's direct influence, but it's also a real, through their advertising, through the money, through the media, creating this sense that the world is okay, that they're leading the way, that we don't need to challenge them at all. So I do think that our ability to continue to create material and content that inspires people, that kind of pulls the mask away from society at large, is really important. So I think that we'll continue to take a creative approach, and that's important. While we get more political, while we consider other tactics, we don't want to lose that creative angle as well. That said, for the political stuff, there has been increased talk about taking more political action, doing direct action, doing civil disobedience with that sense of honor and integrity and seriousness that people have brought to that throughout history, from the suffragettes to Gandhi to the civil rights movement in the US. I don't think it necessarily has to be that far in a lot of places. I think that there are other ways to really make it more political, and a large part of that is talking about the people that stand in our way and being honest about that, and doing that in a spirit first of inviting them to join us in some sense, although we've tried that for a little bit, but really beginning to confront them as well, and beginning to mobilize people both locally but also at the international level to take on these fossil fuel interests and call them out for the effect that they're having on our government. And I think there's more and more specific ways that we can do that as well.
So are we going to see organisations like 350, do you think, coming out and saying that they're going to be shutting down coal-fired power stations, or coming out and targeting specific industries, or are we going to see specific politicians who are holding back legislation kind of told that unless they buck up their ideas, huge campaigning groups are going to be targeting them? Because the kind of the pro-fossil fuel lobby has all of these kinds of tools at their disposal. They've got masses of money, advertising, everything that can really target bits of legislation and kill them. Is this the kind of thing that organisations like 350 are going to have to move towards, do you think?
I think so. I think in large part, yes. Whether or not that means that we're going after coal plants directly one by one is, I think, up for debate. But I do think in general, putting out a message that really explains that we have citizens around the world who are working so hard to build solutions in their community, and time after time after time, they're being stymied because of a lack of political progress, which is being held back by these polluters. So I think that calling them out, tapping into that sense of outrage that people feel about this is going to be really important. I think a large part of that needs to be rooted locally. And I think that that's where these fights against particular coal plants, against natural gas expansion, and against a whole host of other environmental issues is really important. And that's not to say that someone like 350 needs to come in and build it. I think a lot of that is already happening on the ground. Perhaps it hasn't been as unified and turned into a force that can affect something as distant as these UN negotiations as well. But I think it can be, and I think that it's a responsibility for all of us to be figuring out ways that we can connect these local fights with the international context as well. And hopefully that's a place where 350.org, as an organization that is so intensely local in many ways, but also very global, can play a part in bridging those gaps.
And I wanted to ask you about US politics, because from the UK, and it's not something I'm so familiar with, but the climate change seems such a polarised issue now, and I think almost it feels like an ideological issue, like whether you believe in it or not seems to be more related to your ideology perhaps than actually your understanding of the science, or even your exposure to different media. So how is the movement in the US going to kind of leapfrog this polarization and actually bring people together to solve this?
You tell me. No, I think it's a really good question. Instead of diving into kind of the history of how that happened and everything, which I think people have a good handle on, I guess the interesting thing about the U.S. political situation right now is I think that it's much more dynamic than people would expect. There's a lot of people out there saying, oh, we're not going to have progress for 2 years or maybe even 10 years because of what's happened in Congress. I'm not entirely convinced. I think that the U.S. public right now is angry, it's scared, and it's very worried about kind of the direction that not only their lives, individual lives are going, but also the direction the country is going as well. Right now, that energy is being captured by the right, and it's being channeled into kind of a hatred of government, a sense that we need to take back our power from government and all of that. I think that that energy can also be channeled, though, to the real culprits, which is corporations and the economic structure that we have that has really been investing in fossil fuel, letting these companies dump their pollution in our atmosphere for free, running ramshot over our communities, and not investing in the solutions that we need to actually lift the economy back up off the ground. So I think that climate itself is going to have to find a way to really get mixed in with that. It can't remain a separate issue. I think it really does need to be connected back to people's lives and mixed in with the real people that are the culprits of this, which is the fossil fuel companies and those emissions as well. So I think that by tapping into that sense for people that there are solutions, that we're ready to get to work, that we know that they're positive, but we also recognize that there are certain people standing in our way, that's going to hopefully build up more of a movement. The final piece I would say is that I do think that when these disasters strike, when people see what's happening to communities around the world, they do react, and I think they do take part. Not maybe when we just talk about the grand sense of global warming at a global level, but when we do present people with individual stories, with real evidence of what's happening in people's communities, I think that the American public, just like any kind of public, begins to react and have that. So I think that a climate message still has a real place in the politics as we move forward, but we do need to be bringing in more of a analysis that really goes after the people that are standing in our way.
But do you think that kind of big US-based campaigns have missed a trick or two? Because we've just had the Gulf oil spill, we've had an economic downturn, and kind of clear evidence that China is forging ahead in terms of green energy, massive investment in renewables, the biggest wind power sector in the world now. And I think they've just come out in the last couple of days and said they're going to increase solar capacity to 500 gigaton or something, which is just some incomprehensibly high number. That it's 10 times anything the US has ever achieved, and yet this message doesn't seem to be kind of driven home. Watching from the outside, I was expecting a massive reaction to the Gulf oil spill. Like for the first time in decades, you had a big oil spill hitting the US, at home, and yet somehow climate legislation disappeared shortly afterwards.
Well, I think it's important. I mean, there's a large debate about the Gulf oil spill in particular, right? I think it wasn't necessarily seen as a climate issue, and I think that was a problem, of course. But it's also something that's understandable. The Gulf oil spill was a visceral thing. It was about oil, and there was a big reaction to that. It wasn't being able to be translated into climate policy, and I think that was a problem, but it was a little bit separate for people, and I think that's understandable. I think the piece that's promising about the U.S. is coming from where I live in California. There was a proposition on the ballot where people can put propositions there that would change the laws on the books to basically overturn California's global warming laws, our clean energy laws. And it was roundly defeated. Fossil fuel companies put tons of money into this, but a coalition came together of clean tech companies, of advocacy groups, and beat the thing by 20 to 30 points. It was an example that when we call out the people that are behind these propositions, when we articulate a really good vision of what we want, and when we actually mobilize the grassroots and don't do kind of fake PR campaigns, but really get in there and build people at the local level to have that power, we can fight back. We did not see that before. We tried to do this about legislation. It was cap and trade. It was very confusing. I think moving forward, if we start investing in the types of movements that do those three things, take on big polluters, really articulate a vision, and really focus on grassroots organizing, I think we'll have a better chance. That's not to say it's going to happen, but it's worth a shot.
Quite a few comments coming in, people saying about Proposition 23, saying an obvious example of the oil lobby's influence, and that also shows how the public will turn against the oil lobby when they know what's going on. Is it the case, though, that the oil lobby really is behind this, and that kind of the flow of information is being stopped kind of somewhere at the top by the lobby's influence over politicians, and therefore people on the street aren't aware of the dangers of climate change, or indeed the rising oil prices and all the other things? Is that where you think the key choke point is?
Maybe not in terms of public education. I think that there still needs to be that work going on. But let me give you an example of how this works in the U.S. Senate. Heard from one of my friends and through channels of Senate staffers, and they'll tell you this if you go talk to them. A lobbyist will walk into the room in the U.S. Senate. They'll walk up to a politician and say, I have $400,000 that I want to spend in your district on TV advertising. I will either spend it for you or against you. What would you like? And that's how those conversations take part. We are not going to be able to match dollar for dollar the fossil fuel companies. The only way that we can really fight back is to do that with bodies and have people on the ground in those districts who can begin to exert similar pressure in different ways. And really pressure that not only challenges politicians but also supports our champions as well. And I think that by focusing on that, by really calling out the influence where it's happening, and by really putting pressure on politicians to disclose the meetings that they're having with these lobbyists, and maybe even go as far as to sign a pledge to say we will not take any more money from fossil fuel companies, that gets us farther down the road of really reframing this issue in a way that I think can mobilize the public more effectively to fight not only for climate action, but really cleaning up the government in general so that we can take on development and all the other things that we need to be working on as well.
And do you worry that a more aggressive approach to dealing with this issue, so from climate lobbyists, might actually kind of increase the polarization that we've seen if you have kind of people going and targeting power stations or are really aggressively, targeting corporations? Are we going to see the politics of this actually, become more entrenched, or are we beyond that stage anyway?
I think it's a risk, and I think it would be more of a risk if it was coming just from the top down. I think that's why it's so important that these fights need to be really locally rooted. I've spent a lot of time traveling the U.S. and worked down in the South and out in the West and in Republican states and all of that. And when you go to those places and you talk to people about the local issues that they're facing, the coal plant in their community, the dirty water that they're seeing, the influence of corporate power, the lack of jobs because jobs are being, taken out of their community and there isn't anything to build them up, it's not a kind of red or blue issue in the U.S. I think people really resonate on that across political boundaries. That's not to say everybody agrees with us, but I do think that a large part of the American public gets that at a local level. I think the problem is we often lose this debate up in kind of the big rhetoric about cap and trade and all of that, and we forget that the real issues that motivate people are closer to home. So I think that if we can continue to do that, if we can continue to make it about people's lives, then we stand a pretty good chance to not piss off a few people, but at least build up a much larger movement as well that can do this.
And what role is the UN going to have in these kind of new approach to tackling this? Is because I think for a lot of people, and certainly for a lot of our viewers, it's kind of almost incomprehensible, and it's a real challenge to try and make this understandable to people. Is it something that we need people to engage with at an individual level, or is this really kind of something that we should leave our politicians to and just lobby at home? Where's the emphasis? Does it have to be community rooted?
I think it can be community rooted, but the beauty of the internet is that now we can really make community action add up. We still can't change just one light bulb at a time, or even really one coal plant at a time even. We do need to make it much broader. And I think by aggregating all of these actions, by connecting them, by having these big global days of action, maybe not all at the same time, but rolling events around the world or whatever it is, we can make that add up and make that count. So I think we need both. As always, we need to be doing everything at once, but I do think that we have the tools and the approaches now that allow us to begin to do that at least. And remember that we can use these UN meetings as a chance to really all come together and talk about the broad solutions. But the real answer is always back at home, especially in capital cities, but really back in towns, back in districts, back in the places where people have more influence over their politicians and can actually take on these interests that are standing in our way.
So just to wrap up then, what's 350 got lined up over the coming months?
Well, we're still planning it out, but I think that a lot of what we've been talking about, we want to continue to use this global network. The amazing part of 350 is just a broad participation, the fact that people have really taken ownership over the campaign and are leading it on the ground, and we want to continue to empower people to do that even more. So trying to do more of a focus on providing creative tools that people can use, doing trainings that provide people the talents they need to really do this work at the local level, and then really figuring out the types of campaigns that can aggregate all of those community efforts and begin to use them to push some of these political levers that are out there. So it's exciting. I mean, it's going to be hard work. It's not going to be an easy couple years. The failure in Copenhagen and what's happening here isn't making our jobs any easier. But I do think it's really inspiring to walk around this conference center and see all of these different NGOs and to see that people know each other now. I mean, people are really beginning to form the networks from Korea to the UK to the US to Brazil to Mexico that allow us to begin to share strategies and allow us to begin to be kind of the quick and nimble and flexible movement that we need to be to take on these big, hulking zombie behemoths that the fossil fuel companies are quickly becoming. So
that's a nice note to end it on. And Jamie, thanks ever so much for joining us. It's always good to talk to you. Maybe we'll try and catch up with you again if you have time.